Welcome back to this new video. Today we'll see everything we need to take a spectacular shot of the Milky Way. So we'll start from the basics, from planning all the way to using the right settings and post-production. I'll show you my entire workflow since we're right in the middle of Milky Way season, so I'll see you after the intro. Let's start with the location. To do this, we just need to go online and search for light pollution map, which are maps showing light pollution. These maps show us the light pollution of a specific place. That way we can figure out if it's worth going to shoot in that location or if we need to change our destination. I'll tell you right away that mountain locations are definitely the best spots, but there are also places that are very, very interesting even in certain coastal areas, because obviously out at sea you can understand that there's no light pollution. But thanks to these maps, we can find this out before we get there and avoid any surprises. Still related to choosing the location, you need to check the weather, because obviously, as you can imagine, it's essential for these kinds of shots. And if there are even a small scattering of clouds in the sky, they could completely ruin all of our hard work. So we always need to carefully monitor the local weather forecast before making our way out to our chosen spot. The second aspect we need to keep in mind is, of course, planning. So we need to figure out where the Milky Way will be, at what time it will appear, in what position, and whether we can shoot at that specific moment. Because obviously the Milky Way changes depending on the season. So let's say the useful period is more or less between April and October, and the best months are roughly between May and July, or August. But obviously, throughout this entire period, the Milky Way changes. For example, at the end of summer, we will see it right after sunset, whereas around March and April, it will be visible maybe around 3 in the morning. So you can understand that everything changes. To do this, we need an app. For example, I use PhotoPills, and PhotoPills allows us to check where it is, even with augmented reality. By entering the planner section, you can see that at the top in the various tabs, we have the visibility of the galactic center. And by moving through the different hours, we can understand where the Milky Way is located. As you can see in this case, the southern part, which is the most prominent, is the core, which is the most interesting part of the Milky Way, while in the northern part we have the tail, so the less visible part. And as we move, we can see the entire path that the Milky Way takes throughout the night. In addition to this, we also have the possibility to go to the moon section and see both the period in which the moon is present, which is obviously the worst time to take a photo of the Milky Way. And so as you go forward, you can see that the moon becomes smaller and smaller until you reach the new moon, which is the best time to shoot. Because the moon acts as a source of natural light pollution and therefore makes all the details of the Milky Way less visible. So to take a perfect shot of the Milky Way, you should always go during the new moon, or at least during periods close to the new moon. Not obviously during the full moon. And from here we have the possibility to see both the beginning of the visibility of the galactic center and the end of the galactic center. And obviously by changing the day, as you can see, the time updates. This way you have an idea of when the Milky Way will be visible and when it will no longer be visible. The last tab we're going to look at is the one for night AR, so augmented reality. And as you can see, we have the ability to see in real time with augmented reality where the Milky Way is located at that exact time. At the top, you can see the time and date, and as we move forward, we'll see more. You see it adapting as we move, because of course we're changing the time. The red dot indicates the core, so the most interesting part, as we mentioned earlier. And then, if we keep moving, we obviously see the arc of the Milky Way all the way to its tail. So once we've checked that the location is suitable for shooting without light pollution, that the weather is good, and that the Milky Way passes through the desired spot, we've created our composition, maybe with a ruin or a small church, or perhaps we want to use a tent to camp there overnight. So we've set up our composition. Now, of course, we need the equipment. So our equipment will be a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, a wide-angle lens, ideally as bright as possible. I recommend at least an f2.8. then if we have the means, we can get a star tracker, which will help us with this type of shot. And if you want, you can also use a remote shutter release, but if you don't have one, don't worry, because you can use the camera's self-timer. That way, at least when you have it on the tripod, which is another essential tool for this type of shot, when the camera is on the tripod, you avoid vibrations, so that's everything we need. Earlier in the video, I mentioned the star tracker device, which isn't strictly essential for capturing this specific type of shot, but it is actually a fairly important and helpful aid to have. And of course, as I previously mentioned before, you will also definitely need to use the wide-angle lens for the best results. A high-quality wide-angle lens with a large aperture is almost essential because it helps us achieve significantly longer exposure times. By letting much more light into the camera sensor, since light is the fundamental and most critical component we need to capture stunning images in the field of astrophotography. Obviously, you have to decide where to invest your budget. If you don't want to buy another lens, maybe because you think you'll only use it once a year or you already have another one that's not very bright, you can buy a star tracker instead. For example, I use the Nomad. From Move Shot Move, if you need it for your purchase, I'll also leave a discount code in the description. If, on the other hand, you want to buy a lens because you'll also use it in other situations, then look for a lens that's as bright as possible. As for the settings to use when shooting, keep in mind that they're not always fixed and they're not always the same because they depend on a lot of factors. The most important one is how polluted the sky is. There are much darker skies that require longer exposures, so higher ISO, and skies that are a bit more polluted and therefore need a lower ISO. Generally speaking, I can tell you that ISO usually ranges between 2000 and 4000, but this also depends on how much your camera can handle. Because a full-frame camera will definitely handle higher ISO better, while an APS-C will handle them a bit less. Then, following from this, I recommend always using your lens, if it is an f2.8 or faster, always at its maximum aperture. If you have a lens that's f1.4, you can maybe stop down to f1.8 or f2. This way, by stopping down slightly, you also improve the image quality a bit, because lenses usually perform a little less well when used wide open. Of course, it also depends on the type of lens, but generally that's how it is. So, to recap everything about shooting settings, I always have to shoot in manual mode, always in RAW. So, avoid JPEG, because these types of files need to be processed later in post-production, and post-production for the Milky Way, for astrophotography, is one of the most important things. As for ISO, we said between 2000 and 4000. For aperture, we said it depends on the lens, but generally always use the widest aperture possible. And now let's take a look at shutter speeds, because shutter speeds depend on a few parameters. They depend on the camera, they depend on the lens, and they depend on the aperture you use. To do this calculation, let's go back to PhotoPills and I'll show you how to find the right shutter speeds for your camera. As you can see, PhotoPills is always useful for this type of shot, and not only for this. If you get a chance to use it, you'll understand. But in the Spot Stars tab, we find what we need to figure out which shutter speed to use. Here we'll enter our equipment. In my case, I have a Sony a7 III with an 18mm lens used at f2.8. I recommend always leaving it at 0 dig, so you'll have the worst case scenario, because it indicates the stars that are at 0 degree level, which are the ones that move the fastest. Actually, it's not the stars that move, but the Earth that rotates. And to complete a rotation on its axis, they obviously appear to move faster compared to a star that's much higher up. Always leave it at 0, and you'll see that you won't have any problems at all. And it will calculate the maximum time. Next, we have the option to choose either default or accurate, but I recommend leaving it on default. Otherwise, you'll have to use exposure times that are really ridiculously short. And here we have the two rules. In the past, people used the 500 rule, which has now been outdated for several years, because it no longer works with modern cameras. And that's because they're packed and dense with pixels. So forget about the little number you see below, in this case, 28 seconds. What we actually need to look at is the rule itself in PF, because it takes all the numbers into account. Everything we've provided it with, from the camera to the lens to the aperture, and it will make a calculation based on the sensor that your camera uses. As you'll see in this case, I have 14.57 seconds, so I can easily use 15 seconds, but obviously I can't use 20 seconds, because otherwise I'll start to see the stars as streaks. And that's absolutely not good. So I can use less, but definitely not more, unless it's a value that's close, like between 14.57 and 15 seconds. There's absolutely no problem with that. One really fundamental thing during these astrophotography nights is focusing. As you can understand, you can't use autofocus because at night in the dark it wouldn't focus on anything, so you'll have to use manual focus. And from your display, using live view, you'll need to zoom in on the brightest star possible, because that will help you more, and try to focus it using your focus ring. To know if it's really in focus, you need to see the star as sharp and pinpoint as possible. So turn a little to the right, turn a little to the left. When you see it as sharp as possible, that's when you can be sure you've perfectly nailed the focus. And from there, you can start with your first test shot and see if everything is working perfectly. So I take my first shot, zoom, everything, and I check. If the focus is really correct, then I can go ahead with my evening and take all the shots I want. At the beginning, I told you that for astrophotography, you need a wide-angle lens, a bright one, or a star tracker. Now, I don't want to take back everything I said, but I want to help you if you don't have the budget to buy these tools, because you can still try taking photos anyway. Maybe not with excellent results, but with acceptable ones. And you have the possibility to do all this using software that employs the stacking technique. So what does that mean? In the camera, once I've taken one shot, I repeat it another 40 or 50 times. The more I take, the better, though obviously don't overdo it, because then it becomes pointless, but you can easily take 40, 50, or even 60 shots. The software will realign all the stars for me, and then it will significantly decrease the amount of digital noise found in your photos. This specific technique can be used. In fact, it is absolutely and strongly recommended, even in situations where you already possess both a high-quality star tracker and a very wide-angle, fast aperture lens. So I always recommend that you use it, still thinking of those who don't want to spend money. There is also a free software that does this job, and it's called Sequator. Sequator is very easy to use. On my website, you can find a guide with all the information you need to use it at its best. I recommend downloading it because it's completely free. The software will stack all your shots and improve your final result by drastically removing and reducing noise. Obviously, the more shots I take, the more I reduce the noise. Lately, I no longer use Sequator because I prefer the Fusion software, which is part of the AstroPanel plugin. If you want, if you're interested, I'll also leave a discount code for you in the description. And basically, it does the same job as Sequator, but with slightly better results because it's a more innovative software. But anyway, in case you don't want to spend any money, don't worry, Sequator works great. In these software programs, you'll also have the option to add other types of files called darks, flats, and bias. In this case, I don't want to give you a huge lecture on how these types of files work, because I want to keep the tutorial accessible to everyone. So even for those who are just starting out, know that obviously the more things you add, the better. The final result will be better, but once we have the final result, which could be the final result from Sequator, from Fusion, or from any of the thousands of other programs out there that do more or less the same things, we need to understand that this isn't really the final result, but the final result then depends on further processing done in Photoshop or other similar software. For example, I use AstroPanel again here because I get along really well with AstroPanel. There are also free software options that allow you to do the processing, but know that from this point of view, Photoshop is essential because it really gives you one, if not two, extra gears for this type of shot. So if you have the chance, buy Photoshop and work there. your images, even if they're not astrophotography or just landscape photography, know that the quality is definitely better. I'm not going to give you a tutorial here on how to post-process the Milky Way because otherwise this video would become endless. But I can just tell you that the parameters that help you with these types of shots are definitely contrast, texture, dehaze, and clarity. These are the fundamental parameters. Then you can play around a bit with the highlights, but the main ones are more or less these four. I recommend playing around with them a bit, especially if you're just starting out, and seeing what are the best results you can achieve. Then, when you want to take a step forward, move on to a plugin like AstroPanel. And there you'll definitely see better results because it's a plugin made exclusively for the Milky Way or, in any case, deep sky photography. One last piece of advice I feel like giving you for this type of photo is to take a double exposure. So wherever you go to shoot, you'll definitely notice that the sky will be very bright while your foreground will be darker. In these cases, in fact, you use the double exposure technique. So I take one shot dedicated to the sky and one shot dedicated to the landscape without moving the tripod. In this case, I might have a shot with lower ISO and longer exposure times for the landscape, because in that case, I won't have the problem of star trails. Whereas for the sky, I'll do exactly the opposite. So shorter exposure times and higher ISO. This helps us to have a landscape that is recognizable or at least slightly illuminated. And there is also another technique, which is to take the shot at the end of the blue hour so that there is still a bit of light. And this still allows us to avoid taking a shot with extremely long exposure times. This is another technique that is widely used in astrophotography. And I still highly recommend using the artistic double exposure technique because it truly helps you to render a much more detailed landscape in your creative projects. It helps you achieve a well-balanced shot both in the sky and in the landscape to sum everything up. The mistakes you need to avoid are shooting with a full moon or with a very high percentage of the moon visible, because you'll end up with photos that have too much light pollution, and it's also not good to shoot in JPEG. Avoid it, because otherwise you can say goodbye to post-production because a JPEG shot becomes almost impossible to work with. Incorrect focusing, which is one of the major problems, because then when you go back to review your shot, you'll see that the sky is out of focus and you'll have to throw away everything you did during the night. ISOs that are too low, which might seem counterintuitive, but that's actually the case, because if your ISO is too low and the sky is too dark, you won't be able to brighten it up anymore. Because you'll inevitably introduce a significant amount of extra noise when you attempt to brighten the exposure of your image later during the post-processing stage by utilizing professional editing software such as Lightroom or Photoshop. So it's actually worse. So avoid keeping the ISO too low thinking, oh, I'll just increase it later, because that's much worse. Exposure times that are too long are also a problem, because then you'll have star trails, and in this case too, you'll end up having to throw everything away. And above all, choose the right location with little light pollution, and most importantly, make sure the weather conditions are excellent that night. Otherwise, you'll have made the trip for nothing. This is what I feel I should tell you, what you really need to take a great shot of the Milky Way with whatever equipment you have available. In any case, you'll have followed all the necessary steps to get the shot. Great, because if you want to upgrade next year, in 2 years or in 10 years, you will have still learned a workflow that is fundamental and useful for any type of equipment you own. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for watching the video. I hope it wasn't too long or boring. I still don't know how long it will be because I have to edit it. But if you found it useful, I ask you to leave a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. If you have any questions, ask me down below in the comments. I'll reply as soon as possible, and I'll see you in the next video.